If you walk through the streets of Florence, Paris, or Vienna, you are surrounded by the pinnacle of human achievement. The architecture, the infrastructure, and the sheer density of history suggest a civilization at its zenith. But beneath this aesthetic perfection, the industrial and economic plumbing of the European continent is quietly disintegrating. For decades, the global economy was driven by a reliable machine: German manufacturing efficiency, cheap Russian energy, and a stable, aging, but highly skilled workforce. Today, every single one of those pillars has been fractured beyond repair. We are witnessing the beginning of a systemic decoupling where the European Union is transitioning from a global power to a continental museum, a place where the world goes to look at the past rather than invest in the future. The data suggests that this isn't just a temporary recession or a cyclical downturn. It is a structural liquidation of the European economic model. Before we dissect the 6 fatal wounds that are bleeding the continent dry, I must ask you to join our investigation. Understanding these complex global shifts requires looking beneath the surface numbers that mainstream media often ignores. If you value this level of systemic analysis, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. It is the most effective way to support our independent research and ensure we can continue producing these deep dives into the mechanisms of our world. By the end of this investigation, we will reveal why even the most aggressive government interventions, including the recent and urgent Mario Draghi report, might be mathematically incapable of stopping what is already in motion. We're not just looking at a slowing economy. We are observing the physics of systemic entropy in real time. The question is no longer whether Europe can lead the 21st century, but whether it can survive it as a relevant industrial entity. To understand the gravity of the situation, we must first look at the framework of this collapse, the hidden architecture of a system that has finally run out of time and energy. The crisis facing Europe can be defined by a single concept: the entropy loop. In systems engineering, entropy is the measure of disorder and energy loss within a closed environment. For half a century, Europe functioned as an open system, importing cheap energy and exporting high-value goods to a growing global market. However, the continent has now effectively closed itself off through a combination of geopolitical isolation and internal regulatory rigidity. The loop works like this: as industrial energy costs rise, the manufacturing base shrinks. This shrinkage reduces tax revenue, but because the population is aging rapidly, the social costs for pensions and healthcare continue to climb. To fund these costs, governments are forced to increase taxes and regulations on the remaining productive sectors, which in turn drives the last remaining innovators to relocate to the United States or Asia. This is not a problem that can be solved with a simple interest rate adjustment or a new policy paper. It is a mathematical trap where the cost of maintaining the legacy system, the museum state, is now higher than the profit generated by the economy itself. We are observing a system that is consuming its own capital to delay the inevitable realization that its business model is obsolete. For 3 decades, the industrial heart of Europe operated on a silent, highly profitable secret: energy arbitrage. This was the mechanism by which the European Union, led by Germany, imported massive volumes of low-cost natural gas from Russia and converted it into high-value manufactured exports sold to the rest of the world. This arrangement wasn't just a trade deal. It was the foundation of the continent's entire competitive edge. When this flow was severed in 2022, it didn't just create a temporary price spike. It destroyed the fundamental business model of European heavy industry. Unlike the United States, which has achieved energy independence through the shale revolution, Europe remains a massive net importer of energy, now forced to rely on expensive liquefied natural gas, LNG, transported via ships rather than efficient pipelines. This shift has created a permanent structural price delta, where European industrial electricity costs are now consistently 3 times higher than those in North America. For sectors like steel, glass, and chemicals, Energy is not just a utility. It is the primary input cost. When your energy costs triple, your product becomes a liability on the global market, regardless of how efficient your engineer might be. The implications of this energy poverty are systemic and irreversible. We are observing the physical dismantling of the German industrial machine, the BASF and Volkswagen complexes that once served as the continent's economic anchors. These firms are not simply reducing production. They are shifting their capital investment to the United States and China, where energy is cheaper and more reliable. This is the first fatal wound because energy is the master resource. Without a cheap, abundant baseload of power, the infrastructure of the European interior becomes a series of stranded assets. The transition to renewable energy, while ambitious, cannot solve the immediate crisis of industrial viability. Wind and solar provide intermittent electricity, but they do not provide the high-heat thermal energy or the chemical feedstock required for heavy manufacturing. As the continent attempts to green its economy, it is inadvertently pricing its remaining factories out of existence. The result is a hollowed-out economy, where the cost of carbon credits and expensive imports creates a ceiling on growth that no amount of fiscal stimulus can pierce. This is not a transition. It is a liquidation of the industrial commons. While energy poverty is the external wound, the demographic collapse is the internal rot. Europe is currently the world's oldest continent by median age, and the math of its survival is becoming increasingly impossible. In countries like Italy and Spain, fertility rates have plummeted to 1.2 children per woman, well below the 2.1 required for a stable population. This is not just a social issue. It is a total financial trap. A society with a median age of 44 or higher naturally becomes risk-averse. Instead of directing capital toward research, development, and high-risk startups, the European economy is being reconfigured into a silver economy designed to protect the purchasing power of retirees. Wealth is no longer being used to build the future. It is being drained to sustain the past through massive pension obligations and skyrocketing healthcare costs for an elderly population. This creates a silver tsunami that consumes the liquidity of the entire system. The structural impact on the labor market is equally devastating. As the working-age population shrinks, the cost of labor increases, not because of higher productivity, but because of scarcity. This puts European firms in a double bind. They face the highest energy costs in the world and an ever-shrinking pool of talent to manage their increasingly complex regulatory environment. This demographic reality triggers the Venetian trap mentioned in our blueprint. When a society realizes it is shrinking, its political focus shifts from growth to preservation. Governments are forced to increase taxes on the dwindling number of young workers to pay for the social safety nets of the elderly, which in turn encourages the most talented young minds to emigrate to North America. This brain drain is the final stage of the demographic wound. Europe is losing the very people it needs to innovate its way out of the crisis. What remains is a continent of beautiful, historic cities populated by a demographic that lacks the numbers and the dynamism to compete in a 21st century tech-driven world. The system is no longer producing creators, it is producing curators of a fading legacy. In the global theater of technology and innovation, there is a recurring pattern. The United States builds, China scales, and Europe regulates. This phenomenon, often referred to as the Brussels effect, was once seen as a form of soft power, a way for the European Union to set the global standards for privacy, safety, and ethics. However, in the current economic climate, this regulatory impulse has transformed into a form of structural asphyxiation. The European Union has become a referee in a game where it no longer has any star players. By prioritizing precautionary principles over innovation incentives, the continent has created a hostile environment for the very technologies that define the 21st century. While Silicon Valley and Shenzhen are locked in a high-stakes race for AI supremacy and quantum computing, European bureaucrats are focused on drafting 1,500-page documents like the GDPR and the AI Act. These regulations don't just protect consumers. They create a massive compliance tax that disproportionately harms small startups and favors large, entrenched incumbents who can afford the legal overhead. The systemic result of this regulatory obsession is a profound innovation chasm. In the last 2 decades, not a single European company has grown to become a global tech titan on the scale of Amazon, Google, or Tencent. Instead, the continent's regulatory framework acts as a ceiling on growth, forcing homegrown talent to look westward. When a European entrepreneur develops a breakthrough, they quickly realize that navigating the 27 different legal systems of the EU is far more expensive than simply relocating to the United States. This is the third fatal wound, the transformation of law into a barrier rather than a foundation. By attempting to manage risks that haven't even manifested yet, Europe has effectively regulated itself out of the future. The continent is essentially taxing the growth of tomorrow to pay for the comforts of yesterday. As the rest of the world accelerates, Europe remains entangled in its own red tape, celebrating digital sovereignty, while its digital infrastructure is almost entirely dependent on foreign providers. It is a system that values the safety of the status quo over the volatility of progress, leading to a state of managed decline where the only thing being produced at scale is new legislation. For over half a century, Germany was the Stammtisch of the global economy, the reliable, high-performance engine that drove the European project forward. Its model was built on a precise synergy, high-complexity engineering, a disciplined vocational workforce, and a massive trade surplus fueled by exports to China and the United States. But today, the German engine is stalling, and its failure represents the fourth fatal wound for the continent. The deindustrialization of Germany is not a theoretical risk. It is a physical reality visible in the shuttering of factories in the Rhine-Ruhr area and the desperate restructuring of national icons like Volkswagen and BASF. The loss of cheap energy was the catalyst, but the deeper issue is a structural inability to adapt to the transition from the internal combustion engine to the software-defined vehicle. Germany perfected the mechanical age, but it is being outpaced in the digital age. As the global automotive industry shifts toward electric vehicles and autonomous systems, the traditional German advantage in precision gearboxes and piston engines is becoming a legacy liability. This industrial fallout has a devastating ripple effect across the entire Eurozone. Because Germany acts as the primary buyer for components from across the continent, from electronics in Poland to precision parts in Italy, its stagnation is effectively a continental recession. We are seeing a hollowing out of the middle market companies, the Mittelstand, which were once the backbone of European stability. These firms are now facing a triple threat: skyrocketing electricity prices, a shortage of skilled labor due to aging, and a sudden loss of their primary export markets. China, once the biggest customer for German cars, has now become its biggest competitor, producing cheaper, more technologically integrated EVs that are flooding the global market. This is the inevitable conclusion of the entropy loop. When a system relies on a single, aging pillar of strength, its collapse doesn't just damage the structure, it brings the entire roof down. Germany's struggle is a warning for the rest of Europe. The engineering prowess of the 20th century is no longer a shield against the economic realities of the 21st. The industrial heart of Europe is failing, and without it, the European Union loses its primary source of fiscal and political gravity. The fifth fatal wound is perhaps the most invisible yet the most permanent: the total liquidation of a European innovation pipeline. In the modern global economy, wealth is no longer generated by optimizing existing industries, but by capturing the frontier of new technologies. However, the mechanism required to capture this frontier, venture capital, is practically non-existent in Europe when compared to the United States. While the U.S. capital markets are deep, liquid, and culturally comfortable with high-stakes failure, the European financial system remains bank-dominated and risk-averse. European banks are designed to lend against collateral, land, machinery, and existing cash flow, which are precisely the things a disruptive tech startup does not have. This creates a venture gap where U.S. startups receive nearly 5 times more funding than their European counterparts. This isn't just a matter of having less money. It is a matter of systemic trajectory. Because there is no local capital to scale a company from a garage to a global titan, the most promising European inventions are either bought out by American firms or forced to move their headquarters to Delaware to access the funding they need to survive. This chasm leads to a devastating brain drain that functions as a massive, uncompensated transfer of human capital from Europe to North America. The European Union spends billions of euros in public funds to educate world-class PhDs, engineers, and scientists. Yet, because the economic ecosystem is geared toward preservation rather than creation, these highly trained individuals find that their potential is capped by low salaries and a lack of R&D investment. Statistics show that roughly 15% of European PhDs migrate to the United States, taking their patents, their expertise, and their future tax contributions with them. This is the ultimate entropy mechanism. The continent is effectively subsidizing the future dominance of its competitors. By the time a technology reaches the stage where it can be regulated by Brussels, the intellectual and financial ownership of that technology has already left the continent. Europe has become a consumer and a regulator of the future, but it has ceased to be a creator of it. The result is a stagnant corporate landscape where only one of the top 10 largest European firms was founded in the last 25 years, compared to nearly all of them in the U.S. tech sector. The sixth and final wound is the fragmentation tax, the inherent structural inefficiency of a union that claims to be a single market but operates as 27 separate bureaucracies. Despite decades of integration, the European Union remains a collection of national silos when it comes to the most critical infrastructure: energy, defense, and capital markets. This fragmentation prevents the emergence of European champions capable of competing with the massive scale of American and Chinese conglomerates. In the United States, a company can scale to 330 million consumers with a single set of regulations, a single language, and a single capital market. In Europe, a startup must navigate 27 different labor laws, 27 different tax codes, and 27 different sets of compliance requirements. This administrative friction acts as a hidden tax on every transaction and every strategic expansion, ensuring that European firms remain national players in a global game that requires continental scale. This fragmentation is most dangerous in the realm of defense and strategic autonomy. While the U.S. spends over $800 billion annually on a unified military-industrial complex, Europe's defense spending is scattered across dozens of different procurement programs and incompatible systems. This lack of cohesion makes the continent fundamentally dependent on the United States for its security, a vulnerability that has become painfully clear in the current geopolitical landscape. Furthermore, because there is no unified banking union or capital markets union, European savings are not being put to work within the continent. Instead, trillions of euros in European household savings are invested in U.S. index funds and American stocks because the European domestic markets are too fragmented to provide comparable returns. This is the systemic irony of a European project. It is a bloc with the collective wealth to be a superpower, but its internal architecture is so inefficient that it inadvertently funds the growth of its rivals while its own infrastructure decays. The Draghi report urgently calls for deep integration to stop this bleeding, but the political reality of 27 different national interests makes such a systemic repair almost impossible to implement before the entropy becomes terminal. To synthesize these 6 fatal wounds, we must look at the historical precedent of the Venetian Republic. Venice did not collapse overnight. It experienced a centuries-long transition from being the high-tech industrial clearinghouse of the world to a pleasure city for the elite. just as Venice once relied on its arsenal for naval dominance. Modern Europe relies on single points of excellence like ASML in the Netherlands to maintain its seat at the global table. However, a system cannot survive on a single fortress while its surrounding infrastructure, its energy security, its demographic base, and its regulatory environment is in a state of terminal decay. ASML represents the last fortress of European lithography, but as we have seen with the German automotive sector, even the most sophisticated engineering cannot withstand the entropy loop when a master resource of cheap energy is removed. Europe is repeating the Venetian trap, choosing to protect the status quo of a silver economy through high taxes and rigid regulations rather than enduring the painful disruption required to compete on the frontier of AI and energy autonomy. The systemic synthesis of these factors suggests that Europe is no longer a developing or even a stable system. It is a liquidating one. Every year, the gap between U.S. and European GDP per capita widens, not because of a temporary policy error, but because the U.S. has successfully integrated its energy, capital, and innovation markets while Europe remains fragmented. The Mario Draghi report acknowledges this reality, calling for 800 billion euros in annual investment just to stay relevant. Yet, the fragmentation tax and the demographic burden make such a mobilization nearly impossible to achieve without a total overhaul of the European social contract. We are observing a continent that is effectively consuming its own industrial capital to maintain a lifestyle it can no longer afford to produce. In this environment, the entropy loop becomes self-sustaining. Less growth leads to more regulation to protect what remains, which further kills the growth needed to escape the cycle. Europe is not dying in a sudden explosion of crisis, but through a gradual, predictable cooling of its economic engine. A slow transition into a museum state where its only remaining competitive advantage is the prestige of its past. The data we have dissected today reveals a hard truth. Systems do not fail because they run out of ideas. They fail because they run out of the energy and the demographic vitality required to execute them. Europe's 6 fatal wounds are the symptoms of a civilization that has prioritized preservation over progress, stability over volatility, and the curator over the creator. From the deindustrialization of Germany to the demographic liquidation of Italy, the continent is being hollowed out by the very mechanisms it designed to ensure its comfort. We are not predicting a sudden collapse, but rather a long, managed decline into a continental museum, a place of immense beauty and historical significance, but one that has ceased to be a primary driver of human technological evolution. The entropy loop is now the dominant force in the European economy, and unless there is a radical, systemic break from the current regulatory and demographic trajectory, the outcome is mathematically inevitable. If you found this investigative deep dive valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. These actions are the primary way we can continue to produce high-level systemic analysis that looks beneath the surface numbers of the global economy. By understanding these structural forces, you are better equipped to navigate a world that is decoupling faster than most institutions are willing to admit. We will continue to track the entropy loop and the shifting tectonic plates of global industry in our future investigations. Thank you for watching and for being part of this community of thinkers who value structural reality over narrative comfort. Until the next video.